On June 28, 1546, deep beneath the ancient stones of the Tower of London, the Lord Chancellor of England got down on his knees and personally operated the torture device with his own hands. That single, extraordinary detail should stop you cold. Thomas Wriothesley was not a lowly torturer or prison guard. He was the second most powerful legal officer in the entire kingdom. He kept the Great Seal of England. He spoke justice in the name of the king. He sat at the center of the Privy Council and shaped the governance of the nation. Yet there he was, on the cold, damp floor of a tower basement, turning the heavy wooden rollers of the rack himself. The young woman stretched upon that instrument of agony was only 25 years old. Her name was Anne Askew. She had committed no treason against the crown. She had not plotted rebellion, conspired with foreign powers, or raised arms against the king. What she had done was read the Bible in English, form her own theological conclusions, and refuse to abandon them no matter the cost. She believed that bread remained bread, even after a priest spoke sacred words over it. She rejected the idea that the Mass literally transformed it into the flesh of Christ. Under Henry VIII's feared Act of 6 Articles, this belief was punishable by death. But her theological position was already well known. She had written it clearly and stated it openly during previous examinations. The men in that basement did not need another confession of faith. They needed names. Before this story ends, a young woman will be carried to her own execution because her body can no longer walk. A bag of gunpowder will be tied around her neck at the stake as a grim act of mercy. The Queen of England will come within hours of sharing the same fate, and the powerful men who ordered and carried out this torture will walk free, retain their high offices, and die peacefully in their beds decades later, their public reputations largely intact. Anne Askew was never truly the target. She was the mechanism they hoped would destroy an entire political and religious faction. To understand how this happened, we must step into England in the spring of 1546, a kingdom trembling on the edge of uncertainty. Henry VIII was 54 years old and visibly dying, though no one at court dared speak the word aloud. A festering ulcer on his left leg caused him constant, excruciating pain. Once celebrated as the most athletic and handsome prince in Europe, he had grown enormously heavy. He could no longer walk freely and was carried through his palaces in specially built chairs. His mind, once sharp, was increasingly clouded by pain and illness. His only male heir, Prince Edward, was just 9 years old. A child king meant a regency council, and whoever controlled that council would effectively rule England for years. Two powerful factions formed around this reality, each fighting for survival and dominance. On one side stood the religious conservatives, Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley. They wanted the Church of England to remain largely Catholic in doctrine, despite its break from Rome. On the other side stood Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and the growing network of Protestant sympathizers gathered around Henry's sixth and final wife, Queen Catherine Parr. The battle was not purely about theology, it was about raw political power, who would control England after Henry's death. Theology was simply the sharpest legal weapon available. The conservatives already possessed a powerful tool, the Act of 6 Articles, signed by Henry in 1539. Known to Protestants as the whip with 6 strings, it enforced Catholic orthodoxy on key doctrines, especially transubstantiation. Denying that bread and wine literally became Christ's flesh and blood was a capital offense on the first conviction. In the spring of 1546, the conservatives decided to strike. They would use the act against the Protestant ladies closest to Queen Catherine Parr. If they could link these women to heresy through documented evidence, Catherine herself would become vulnerable. Removing a Protestant queen near the end of Henry's life could shift the balance of power forever. They needed a witness who could provide credible names. They chose Anne Askew, and they were wrong. Anne Askew was born in 1521 in Lincolnshire into a respectable gentry family. She received an unusually strong education for a woman of her time, including Latin and deep study of Scripture. Lincolnshire was not isolated from the religious ideas sweeping England. Protestant books in the English Bible reached literate households, and Anne engaged with them seriously and independently. In the late 1530s, she was married to Thomas Kyme, a traditional Catholic gentleman. The marriage had originally been arranged for her older sister, who died. Anne was substituted into the contract. The union was deeply unhappy. Anne's growing Protestant convictions clashed violently with her husband's faith. She preached openly in Lincoln Cathedral without permission, distributed reformist literature, and refused practices she viewed as idolatrous. Eventually, Kyme expelled her from their home. Anne reclaimed her maiden name, a bold and public act in Tudor England, where a married woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's. By doing so, she declared her independence and accepted the dangerous consequences. She arrived in London around 1544 or early 1545. There she connected with reformist networks linked to the Queen's household. She preached informally, debated theology, and made herself a visible presence in Protestant circles at a time when such visibility carried mortal risk. In March 1545, she was arrested for the first time on charges of heresy. During her examination, she displayed remarkable skill. She answered questions with scripture, redirected her interrogators, and gave responses that were truthful, yet carefully worded to avoid providing clear legal ammunition. She frustrated her examiners without giving them an easy conviction. Through court connections, she was eventually bailed out. Most people would have fled London or gone silent. Anne chose to stay. She continued her work, fully aware of the danger. In May 1546, she was arrested again. This time the examination was conducted by the highest levels of government. While theology was discussed, the real focus quickly shifted to intelligence gathering. They pressed her relentlessly for names, who had supported her financially, which ladies at court had helped her, specifically naming figures close to Queen Catherine Parr, such as Anne Herbert, the Queen's sister, Joan Denny, and Catherine Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk. Anne Askew gave them nothing. She was sent to the Tower of London, a place that carried its own grim grammar in Tudor England. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Anne Boleyn had all entered those walls and never left alive. Placement there signaled that the outcome had already been decided. Still, Anne refused to name anyone. Then came the order, put her on the rack. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Anthony Knevet, began the process but soon stopped. He could not continue. He left the Tower and went directly to King Henry at Hampton Court to report what had been ordered. Into the vacuum stepped Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich. These two senior legal officials got down on the floor themselves and personally turned the rollers of the rack, stretching Anne's body with brutal force for an extended period. She named no one. The damage was catastrophic. Her joints, limbs, and spine were severely compromised. When the session finally ended, she could not stand or walk. She was left lying on the cold stone floor of the Tower for hours, in agony, while questioning continued. Even then, she revealed nothing. Her trial was swift. She was convicted under the Act of 6 Articles and sentenced to death by burning at the stake. Between her sentencing and execution, despite her injuries, Anne composed a poem that survived. It speaks in the voice of a knight preparing for battle, resolute, dignified, and completely in control of her own legacy. On July 16, 1546, 4 people condemned for heresy were taken to Smithfield Market. The 3 men walked. Anne Askew was carried in a chair because she could not walk. She was secured to the stake in a seated position. Bags of gunpowder were tied around all 4 necks as a final, grim mercy. A royal pardon was offered at the last moment if she would recant. She refused. The fire was lit. The powder exploded. Anne Askew died at the age of 25. But her voice refused to die with her body. Her detailed written accounts of the examinations had already been smuggled out of England. Protestant exile John Bale published them in Germany, the first while she was still alive. These documents spread across Protestant Europe and filtered back into England. Later, John Fox included her full story and writings in his monumental Acts and Monuments, a book that became essential reading in Elizabethan churches. Her own words, precise, controlled, and unemotional, painted a devastating picture of the political game being played and her steadfast refusal to participate in it. The conservative faction's plan ultimately failed. Without names from Anne, they lacked the evidence needed to move decisively against Queen Catherine Parr. A warrant for the Queen's arrest was drawn up, but never served. Catherine survived Henry VIII, who died in January 1547. The Protestant faction gained power during young Edward VI's reign. The Act of 6 Articles was repealed within a year of Anne's death. The very beliefs for which Anne had been tortured and executed became legal in England. Thomas Wriothesley lost his position as Lord Chancellor. Richard Rich later held the same office but is now remembered mostly in connection with Anne Askew. Neither man faced any real consequences for what happened in that tower basement. Anne Askew's broken body was carried through the streets of London to Smithfield, but her written testimony traveled freely across borders and centuries. A young woman with no title, no army, and no powerful protectors gave the most powerful legal officers in England exactly what they could not force from her: nothing. And in the end, her words outlasted the king who signed her death warrant, the law that condemned her, and the men who personally turned the rack with their own hands. End script voiceover. This story is drawn directly from Anne Askew's own surviving writings, contemporary records, and John Fox's Acts and Monuments. While dramatized for storytelling, the key events, her arrests, the personal involvement of the Lord Chancellor in her torture, her silence under interrogation, and the political context are well documented in historical sources. If this one hit you hard, tell me in the comments. Which moment revealed the most about Anne Askew's incredible strength and character? More powerful, untold stories from history are coming. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss them. See you in the next one.